The words were a splinter, lodged deep beneath the skin, festering. Useless, they'd called me. Not shouted in anger, but delivered with a soft, dismissive sigh, as if stating an obvious, regrettable fact, as if my very existence was an inconvenience, a drain, a thing without purpose or value in their polished, important world. It was during one of their family dinners, the kind where the silverware gleamed and the laughter was a little too loud, a little too performative. He, my ex-husband, Edward, with that perpetual air of a man who'd just closed a major deal, stood by the fireplace, brandy swirling in his glass. His sister, Clara, perched on the arm of a velvet chair, sharp angles and sharper wit. Their eyes met over my head, a silent, condescending understanding passing between them. I just offered an idea, a suggestion about something mundane, perhaps related to finances or a household problem. I don't even remember the specifics now. The details blurred long ago, leaving only the searing heat of their collective gaze and the quiet pronouncement. Clara had smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "Oh, Sarah, you don't need to trouble your head with that. It's a bit beyond your scope, isn't it? Some things just require a different kind of mind." And Edward, my rock, my partner of 20 years, had simply nodded, adding, "Clara's right, darling. You're not really built for that kind of thing. Best leave it to us. You're much better at, well, keeping the house nice." Useless. The word wasn't spoken then, not out loud, but it hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, implied in every dismissive gesture, every patronizing tone, every glance that said I was decorative at best, an obstacle at worst. It wasn't just that one dinner, of course. It was the culmination of years. Years of being told I was too sensitive, too naive, too quiet, too unambitious. Years of my contributions, my efforts, my very self being subtly, or not so subtly, erased from the narrative of our shared life, our shared future. They were the doers, the thinkers, the powerful. I was the one who faded into the background, the supporting character in the grand drama of their success. I remember looking around that room, the expensive art on the walls, the heavy antique furniture, the way the light caught the crystal chandelier, turning it into 1,000 tiny glittering stars. It was a world they had built, or so they believed, a world I was meant to simply inhabit, passively and without opinion. But even then, beneath the crushing weight of their dismissal, a tiny, defiant spark flickered. It was a spark born of humiliation and pain, a raw, wounded thing, but it was mine. They saw a woman whose only value was in maintaining the facade, in providing a quiet, unobtrusive presence. They didn't see the mind that catalogued every slight, the heart that ached with a fierce, silent intensity, the will that had been bent but not broken. They saw useless, and for a long time I almost believed them. The years that followed Edward's departure only solidified their view of me, and for a while my own view of myself. The divorce was messy, as divorces often are, though outwardly civilized. Edward was generous, they all said, leaving me the house, albeit with a hefty mortgage still attached, and a modest settlement. Modest, of course, compared to the empire they were building. Clara and Edward, and eventually their circle of equally self-important associates at the Pinnacle Group. That was the company, built on the back of a small, struggling firm Edward had inherited and which they had ruthlessly expanded, looked upon my quieter life with pity mixed with disdain. My garden became my refuge. I spent hours there, digging in the soil, nurturing things that grew and flourished under my care. A stark contrast to the emotional barrenness of my relationships. I saw Clara occasionally at social events I couldn't quite avoid. She'd offer platitudes, always with that same practiced, unfeeling smile. "How are you keeping busy, Sarah?" Busy? As if my life needed external validation through constant activity. She'd never ask about my thoughts, my feelings, just what occupied my time. Edward was more distant, a king surveying his domain from afar. Our calls were brief, transactional, usually concerning the house or finances. He'd speak of the Pinnacle Group with reverence, the way some people speak of a deity. It was his life, his legacy, the monument to his supposed genius. He'd talk about the long hours, the crucial deals, the importance of having the right people around him. I knew implicitly that I was not, nor had I ever been, one of the right people. I was a relic of a simpler time, a discarded prototype that didn't fit into the sleek, modern machine they had created. There was Mrs. Gable, my neighbor across the street, a kind, elderly woman who'd lost her husband years ago. She'd wave from her porch, sometimes bring over a plate of cookies. She saw me as I presented myself, quiet, perhaps a little lonely, focused on my home and garden. She'd talk about her late husband's job, his retirement, the simple rhythm of their life. Her world felt comforting, uncomplicated, a stark contrast to the relentless ambition and subtle cruelty of Edward and Clara's sphere. She'd say things like, "You've made this place so lovely, Sarah, a real sanctuary." Yes, that was precisely what it was. A place where I could retreat, lick my wounds, and where their judgments couldn't easily reach me. But even within the sanctuary, the echo of their words persisted. Useless. It was a brand seared onto my self-worth. I started to believe it. Why try? Why strive? The world of business, of ambition, of power, it wasn't for me. It was for people like them, people who were cutthroat enough, intelligent enough, useful enough. For a long time I was adrift in that belief, a ship without sails, bobbing aimlessly on a sea of quiet resignation. The house, once a symbol of our shared life, became a cage, albeit a comfortable one. I dusted the expensive furniture, polished the gleaming silverware they'd left behind, tended the garden, and wondered if this was the sum total of a life lived with someone else's expectations as the only compass? The emptiness was a dull ache, constant and pervasive. The turning point wasn't dramatic, not like in films. It was quiet, insidious, growing like a persistent weed in the cracks of my carefully constructed resignation. I was reading the business section of the local paper, a habit I'd picked up mindlessly, perhaps as a way to feel connected, however remotely, to the world they inhabited. There was an article about the Pinnacle Group. It spoke of recent expansion, of a bold new acquisition, of Edward's leadership being praised as visionary. And Clara was quoted too, her words sharp and confident, outlining their strategy. As I read, a familiar wave of inadequacy washed over me. They were soaring, and I was in my quiet house, with my quiet life. Then a small detail in the article caught my eye. It mentioned a significant debt incurred by the new acquisition, a risk factor downplayed by Edward, but highlighted by the financial journalist. It was a small crack in their polished facade. Later that week, sorting through old boxes in the attic, another quiet, useless pastime, I'd thought I found an old portfolio. It was from years ago, before I married Edward, back when I'd worked briefly for a small consulting firm. It contained market analyses I'd done, proposals I'd drafted, notes on strategy. I hadn't been in a glamorous role, nothing like what Edward and Clara did, but I'd been good at it. I'd had an eye for detail, a knack for identifying weaknesses and opportunities that others missed. I remembered the satisfaction of the work, the quiet pride in a job well done, holding that portfolio, feeling the weight of the paper, seeing my own handwriting filling the margins, was like finding a forgotten piece of myself, a part that hadn't been deemed useless, a part that had actually been quite tiny capable. That night, I couldn't sleep. The journalist's comment about the debt, the memory of my own analytical skills, the persistent echo of their dismissive words, it all swirled together. They saw me as incapable of understanding their world, let alone participating in it. They believed my mind wasn't built for that kind of thing. What if they were wrong? What if their arrogance had blinded them? What if the very weaknesses they saw in me, my quiet observation, my attention to detail, my tendency to think deeply rather than act impulsively, were actually strengths they lacked? The seed wasn't revenge. Not initially. It was a quiet, burning need to prove them wrong. not to them but to myself, to reclaim the part of me they had tried to bury, and the target, the ultimate refutation of their judgment, had to be the very thing they held most dear, the monument to their self-proclaimed superiority, the Pinnacle Group. The idea was absurd, impossible. A woman dismissed as useless, living a quiet life, buying the company run by the very people who had dismissed her. It was a fantasy, but as the sleepless nights continued, the fantasy began to take shape, hardening into a fragile, terrifying possibility. I started researching not just about Pinnacle, but about corporate finance, acquisitions, market trends. Late at night, long after Mrs. Gable's lights were out, my computer screen glowed, illuminating a world they thought was exclusively theirs, gathering the necessary strength, and more crucially, the resources, felt like trying to move a mountain with a spoon. Where would I, the useless woman living in her garden sanctuary, get the kind of money needed to even contemplate buying a company like the Pinnacle Group? The modest settlement Edward had left me was laughably inadequate. The house, while valuable, wasn't liquid without selling, and selling felt like admitting defeat, abandoning my sanctuary. This was where the layered reveals, the hidden aspects of my life they never bothered to see, began to surface, even to myself. My parents, long gone, had been quiet, frugal people. They hadn't amassed vast fortunes, but they had been wise investors, particularly my mother. After they passed, their small portfolio had been left to me. I'd received the statements over the years, filing them away without much thought, focused on the immediate task of survival, of simply getting by after the divorce. Now I pulled them out. The numbers were larger than I remembered. Their investments, left untouched and compounding for decades, had grown into a sum that was significant, though still likely not enough on its own. But it was a start, a real start. I realized, with a jolt, how little Edward and Clara knew about my background, my family. They had always been too focused on their own lineage, their own trajectory. My quiet life had shielded me, inadvertently concealing a hidden reservoir of potential. The next step was the knowledge. I devoured books on finance, watched online lectures, read industry reports. My brain, which they had deemed unfit for that kind of thing, felt sharp, alive, absorbing information like a sponge. It was exhilarating. I remembered the satisfaction from my brief career years ago, the puzzle-solving aspect of business analysis. It wasn't glamorous, but it required a meticulous mind, something I discovered I possessed in abundance. I needed advice, professional guidance, but I knew I couldn't go through any of the major firms Edward and Clara might use, or who might recognize my name and connect me to them. I needed someone discreet, someone who wouldn't dismiss me based on appearances. I found a small independent financial consultant, a woman named Eleanor Vance, recommended by a distant acquaintance of my late mother's. Eleanor was sharp, no nonsense, with kind eyes, but a formidable intellect. When I first sat in her office, in my simple dress and sensible shoes, explaining, vaguely at first, what I was contemplating, I braced myself for a polite version of the dismissal I was so used to. Instead, she listened intently, asking precise, insightful questions. When I laid out the initial figures, the potential sources of funding, the quiet confidence in my voice must have resonated. She didn't see the useless woman my family saw. She saw a client with a serious proposition. She became my guide through the labyrinthine world of corporate finance, mergers, and acquisitions. She explained complex terms in simple language, helped me understand the mechanisms of leverage, the intricacies of due diligence. She treated me with respect, as an equal, as someone capable. This external validation, so different from the constant invalidation I'd experienced, was profoundly empowering. It fueled my determination. We worked in secret, building a plan, exploring funding options beyond my inheritance. It was a slow, painstaking process, filled with hurdles and moments of doubt. There were times I felt overwhelmed, the enormity of the task crushing. But then I would remember the look in Clara's eyes, the dismissive nod from Edward, the feeling of being utterly, completely erased. And the quiet fire would ignite again. The mountain was still there, but I no longer felt I was using a spoon. Eleanor helped me find the right tools, the right leverage points. Slowly, piece by piece, the impossible began to feel merely improbable, then challenging, then achievable. The resources weren't just financial, they were also internal, the rediscovery of my own capabilities, the resilience forged in years of quiet struggle, the unwavering focus on the goal. They thought I was busy with my garden and my memories. They had no idea I was cultivating something far more complex, far more dangerous, right under their noses. Watching them became a morbid fascination, a strategic necessity. From a distance, I observed their world, the world of the Pinnacle Group. I followed industry news, read every press release, every quarterly report. Eleanor helped me access financial data, analyze their performance, identify vulnerabilities. The debt mentioned in the article was indeed a significant factor. Their rapid expansion had left them overextended, reliant on continued growth to service their obligations. They were building a house of cards, albeit a very tall, impressive-looking one. I saw Edward at a distance sometimes, at charity events or in the city. He always seemed confident, jovial, the picture of success. Clara, too, was often featured in society pages or business journals, portrayed as a sharp, influential woman. They exuded an aura of effortless power, the kind that comes from never having faced true adversity, never having been told they were fundamentally lacking. This outward projection of invincibility only underscored the irony of the situation. They were so focused on conquering the world, they failed to notice the quiet figure meticulously studying their every move from the shadows. I would listen to snippets of their conversations overheard at public gatherings, or relayed through mutual, unsuspecting acquaintances. They'd talk about company politics, about colleagues they deemed incompetent, about their future plans, and sometimes, inevitably, my name would come up, usually in passing, a footnote in their current lives. "Oh, Sarah's doing fine, I suppose. Still in the old house," said, with that same tone of gentle pity, tinged with relief that I wasn't their problem anymore. They never imagined I was actively engaged in anything that required more effort than watering petunias. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth, but also a source of immense strength. Their underestimation of me was my greatest asset. They had built their success on the assumption that people were either useful or useless, powerful or powerless. They couldn't comprehend someone transitioning between those states, especially not someone they had personally categorized and discarded. I knew their habits, their blind spots, their arrogance. I knew how they reacted under pressure. Poorly, it turned out, if the pressure was unexpected and came from an unknown source. I learned about the key players at Pinnacle, the shareholders, the board members. I understood the internal dynamics, the alliances, and rivalries. All the while I maintained my quiet life, my garden, my seemingly harmless routine. Mrs. Gable would still wave, comment on my roses. Other acquaintances would offer sympathetic smiles. No one suspected the storm gathering beneath the placid surface. The contrast between my external presentation, the quiet, unassuming woman, and my internal state, sharp, focused, determined, was a constant, almost thrilling tension. They saw the reflection they had created. I was building the reality they wouldn't see coming. The weight of the secret was heavy, a constant pressure, but it also fueled me. Every condescending glance, every patronizing word I overheard or recalled, was another brick in the foundation of my resolve. They had called me useless. Soon, they would see the catastrophic error of their judgment. The time for watching was nearing its end. The time for action was approaching. The opportunity, when it finally arrived, didn't announce itself with fanfare. It emerged from the very vulnerability I had identified. The bold acquisition Edward had been so proud of soured, Market conditions shifted unexpectedly. Debt servicing became a burden, and the anticipated synergies failed to materialize. The Pinnacle Group began to struggle. Publicly, Edward and Clara maintained their confident facade, but behind the scenes there were whispers, then murmurs, then increasingly loud concerns from shareholders. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Eleanor, my financial guide, was invaluable. She had cultivated relationships with key players, people who saw the numbers, the reality behind the bluster. She alerted me to a significant block of shares held by an early investor, a man disillusioned with the current leadership and eager to sell his stake. It wasn't a controlling interest, but acquiring it would make me a significant shareholder and, more importantly, give me leverage and insight into the company's inner workings. The funds I had, combined with careful financing Eleanor had arranged, were sufficient for this initial step. The process was complex, shrouded in confidentiality agreements. Lawyers were involved, due diligence performed. Each step felt momentous, terrifying. I was navigating a world they inhabited with ease, but I was doing it deliberately, strategically, driven by a purpose far deeper than their corporate ambitions. The man selling the shares, Mr. Harrison, was a no-nonsense businessman, unimpressed by titles or family connections. He met with me, not in a flashy corporate office, but in a quiet room downtown. He looked at me, the seemingly ordinary woman, and then he looked at the detailed proposal Eleanor and I had prepared. He asked pointed questions, testing my understanding, my resolve. I answered calmly, drawing on months of research and my own rediscovered analytical skills. I didn't try to be someone I wasn't. I was simply myself, focused and prepared. He saw past the quiet exterior, seeing the substance beneath. "You understand the risks, Miss Sarah?" he asked, his voice gruff but fair. "Risks inherent in the market." "Yes," I replied, "but I also understand the potential, and I believe the current leadership is failing to recognize both." He studied me for a long moment, his eyes sharp. Then he nodded slowly. "They're arrogant," he stated, not a question. "They think they're untouchable." "Perhaps," I said quietly, "they haven't met the right kind of challenge yet." He smiled then, a rare, genuine smile. The deal was struck. This was only the beginning, a significant foothold, not the final takeover, but it shifted the dynamic. I was no longer merely an observer. I was a player, albeit one still operating from the shadows. The tension was almost unbearable. I attended the next shareholders' meeting, a silent presence in the back of the room. I saw Edward at the podium, confident but with a flicker of strain around his eyes. I saw Clara nearby, scanning the room with her usual assessing gaze. They had no idea I was there, that I now held a not insignificant piece of their kingdom. The irony was exquisite, a sharp, clean blade twisting in the wound of their past dismissal. I was no longer just thinking about buying the company. I was actively moving towards it, step by careful step, and with each step the quiet strength I had cultivated grew, hardening into a formidable force. The woman they called useless was on the move. My actions began to have ripples, small, almost imperceptible at first, then growing into larger waves that disturbed the placid surface of their corporate world. As a significant shareholder, I started asking questions, formal queries submitted through the proper channels, requesting information, questioning decisions, particularly those related to the struggling acquisition and the increasing debt. These questions were pointed, informed, clearly coming from someone who understood the business and its financials. Edward and Clara initially dismissed them as coming from a minor nuisance shareholder. They didn't know who I was, as I had acquired the shares through a holding entity Eleanor had established. They likely assumed it was some disgruntled small investor or a competitor trying to stir up trouble. Their responses were initially boilerplate, dismissive. But I persisted, each question more specific, more challenging than the last. Eleanor advised me, guiding me on which levers to pull, which regulations to cite. My quiet persistence was not something they were equipped to handle. They were used to dealing with people they could either charm, intimidate, or overpower. My method was different, quiet, relentless, grounded in facts and figures they couldn't easily dispute. The tension within Pinnacle began to rise. Board meetings became more fraught. There were rumors of disagreements at the executive level. Edward and Clara, used to presenting a united impenetrable front, started showing signs of strain. I heard snippets through various channels, hushed phone calls overheard by people I knew, offhand comments made by associates at industry events. They were searching for the source of the pressure. This unknown shareholder causing trouble. They suspected competitors, former employees, anyone but the useless woman they had discarded. The delicious irony of their frantic search fueled my determination. They were looking everywhere but down at the ground where they had left me. I started to receive calls and emails from other shareholders, some concerned about the company's performance, others simply curious about the identity of the new active shareholder who was challenging the status quo. Some saw me as a threat, others as a potential ally. I was careful in my communication, measured, professional, revealing nothing of my identity or my ultimate goal, only expressing my concerns about the company's direction and leadership. The walls were closing in slowly but surely, not just on Pinnacle but on the carefully constructed world Edward and Clara inhabited. Their control was not as absolute as they believed. Their foundation was not as solid. And the pressure, applied quietly and strategically from the outside, was starting to reveal the cracks. They were reacting, expending energy trying to find and fight an unseen enemy. Meanwhile, I was simply executing the plan, step by careful step, using the very skills they claimed I lacked. The tension was a live wire, buzzing just beneath the surface of my calm exterior. But it wasn't fear, it was anticipation. The moment of the reveal was coming, and the thought sent a tremor of dark excitement through me. They called me useless. Soon they would understand the true cost of that judgment. The acquisition wasn't a single dramatic event, but a process, a series of calculated moves, leading to an inevitable conclusion. The initial share purchase was just the opening gambit. With Eleanor's expertise and my growing understanding of the company's vulnerabilities, we continued to acquire shares, slowly, methodically, often through different channels, to avoid raising immediate alarms. The company's financial situation worsened, exacerbated by market downturns and their continued inability to integrate the troubled acquisition. Edward and Clara became more desperate, making hasty decisions that only compounded their problems. Their arrogance was their undoing. They refused to admit they had made a mistake, doubling down on failed strategies. This created further dissent among other shareholders and the board, opening up opportunities for me. I was no longer just a concerned shareholder. I was building towards a controlling interest. The media started to pick up on the instability at Pinnacle. Articles appeared, questioning Edward's leadership, highlighting the company's debt. The pressure mounted. There were rumors of a potential hostile takeover. Edward and Clara were in damage control mode, giving interviews, trying to project an image of strength and stability that was rapidly deteriorating. I watched it all unfold, a silent spectator with intimate knowledge of the drama, a knowledge they were frantically trying to acquire. I instructed Eleanor to continue acquiring shares, targeting specific blocks that would weaken their control. We leveraged my assets, secured further financing based on the company's troubled state, a grim kind of opportunity. Legal teams were brought in, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. It was a complex dance, every step needing to be precise, legally sound, and utterly confidential. The tension was a physical weight in my chest. There were moments of intense fear, the fear of failure, of exposing myself only to fall short. But stronger than the fear was the quiet, burning certainty that this was necessary. Not just for vindication, but because I genuinely believed I could steer the company onto a better path. My analysis showed that while troubled, Pinnacle wasn't beyond saving, but it required a fundamental shift in strategy and, more importantly, in leadership. The final push came when a majority of the board, seeing the writing on the wall and facing pressure from frustrated shareholders, indicated a willingness to consider an offer for the company. Edward and Clara fought tooth and nail trying to rally support, but their past arrogance and current mismanagement had eroded their credibility. This was the moment. Eleanor and I, working tirelessly with the legal team, prepared the formal offer. It was presented not under my name, but under a corporate entity, a shell designed to maintain secrecy until the very last moment. The offer was fair, perhaps even generous considering the circumstances, but it came with conditions that would fundamentally change the leadership structure. The days that followed were a blur of legal negotiations, financial transfers, and waiting. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by calls with Eleanor and my legal team. I continued my routine, gardening, walking, maintaining the facade of my quiet life, while inside, my heart hammered against my ribs. The final signatures were exchanged electronically. Late one evening, Eleanor called. "It's done, Sarah," she said, her voice calm. "The offer has been accepted. You own the Pinnacle Group." The words hung in the air, immense and impossible. I sat in my quiet living room, surrounded by the symbols of the life they thought I was meant to live, and felt a wave of something profound and complex wash over me. It wasn't triumph, not solely. It was a deep, quiet satisfaction, a sense of inevitability, and a lingering sadness for the relationships that had fractured beyond repair. They had called me useless. Now, I held the keys to their kingdom. The reveal, when it came, wasn't from me. The news broke first in the financial press, a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the industry. "Mysterious investor acquires troubled Pinnacle Group," read the headlines. Initial speculation ran wild. Was it a competitor? A private equity firm? No one suspected the truth. The official announcement, required by regulatory bodies, listed the acquiring entity. It wasn't my personal name, but the name of the holding company. However, digging reporters, and likely Edward and Clara's own frantic efforts, quickly uncovered the beneficial owner. My name, Sarah Jenkins, was suddenly splashed across business news sites and social media. The calls started immediately. First, my lawyer, informing me of the public announcement. Then, Eleanor, confirming the news was out. And then Clara called first. Her voice, usually so composed, was strained, edged with disbelief and a rapidly escalating panic. "Sarah? Is this the news? Guy? It's not you, is it? This Pinnacle thing. It can't be you." There was a desperate quality to her tone, a refusal to accept the impossible. "It is, Clara," I said, my voice steady, calm. The contrast with her near hysteria was stark. "I acquired the company." There was a stunned silence on the other end, followed by a choked gasp. "But how? Why? You don't know anything about business," Edward said. "We all thought." Her carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing the fear and utter bewilderment beneath. Her voice rose, losing all its practiced charm. "You were useless. That's what you were. What do you think you're doing?" "Cleaning up a mess," I replied, the words quiet, but carrying the weight of years of unspoken truth. She disconnected abruptly. Edward called minutes later. His voice was colder, tinged with anger rather than outright panic, though I could sense the controlled fury beneath. "Sarah, what is the meaning of this? This is a mistake. A terrible mistake. You can't possibly run Pinnacle. You're not equipped for it." He sounded like a man who had just discovered his prized possession had been stolen, not by a master thief, but by someone he believed incapable of such an act. "Edward," I said, using his name felt foreign, distant now. "The company is facing significant challenges. Challenges that your leadership failed to address. I believe I can." "My leadership?" He scoffed, disbelief ringing in his voice. "I built that company. You were just there, in the house. You had no idea what it took." "Perhaps," I said, a quiet intensity entering my voice. "I had a much clearer idea than you ever gave me credit for. I watched. I learned. While you were busy being important, I was paying attention." He launched into a tirade then, a mix of accusations, insults, and threats. He called me manipulative, vindictive, crazy. He threw the word useless at me again, this time weaponized, spat out in anger. "You're still useless, Sarah. You just got lucky. You'll run it into the ground." That, I said calmly, letting a sliver of steel enter my tone, remains to be seen. But it will be my ground, Edward, not yours. I ended the call. The initial shock gave way to a strange kind of quietude. The world around me was in chaos. News cycles buzzing, phones ringing, emails flooding in. But in my house, in my sanctuary, there was a profound stillness. They had been forced to confront the reality of their judgment, the catastrophic error of underestimating me. Their disbelief was the ultimate, undeniable validation. They had called me useless. Now I held the company they worked for. The confrontations didn't end with those initial panicked phone calls. They escalated, taking on different forms. Edward, still reeling from the shock and the public humiliation, instructed his lawyers to look for any possible angle to challenge the acquisition. There were veiled legal threats, attempts to find technicalities, anything to undo what had been done. His lawyers contacted mine, but Eleanor and our legal team had been meticulous. The acquisition was sound, legally unimpeachable. There was nothing he could do to reverse it. Seeing the legal avenue blocked, the personal attacks intensified. Edward and Clara, along with some of their loyalists within the company and their social circle, launched a whisper campaign. They spread rumors, questioned my competence, suggested I was unstable or acting on someone else's behalf. They painted me as a vengeful, irrational woman driven by spite. It was a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, to undermine my legitimacy in the eyes of the public and, crucially, the employees of Pinnacle. I heard about it from various sources: sympathetic former colleagues, minor shareholders who hadn't sold their shares, even Mrs. Gable, who'd heard something vaguely unsettling at her bridge club about poor Edward's company. It hurt, of course. The lies and the malice stung, but it also highlighted their desperation. They were flailing, unable to comprehend how the woman they had so easily dismissed could possibly wield such power. I didn't engage in a public war of words. My lawyers advised against it, and more importantly, it wasn't my style. My response was action. I held meetings, not public spectacles, but quiet focus sessions with key personnel at Pinnacle. I listened. I asked questions. I didn't pretend to have all the answers on day one, but I demonstrated that I was informed, capable of understanding the challenges, and committed to finding solutions. I met with department heads, managers, even long-time employees on the factory floor. I saw the relief in some faces, the cynicism in others, the uncertainty in most. I didn't talk about the past or the reasons behind the acquisition. I talked about the future, about stabilizing the company, about valuing the people who actually did the work. There was a long-serving operations manager, a gruff man who had worked under Edward for decades. In our meeting, he was initially wary. He probably saw me as another out-of-touch executive. I asked him about the practical problems he faced, the inefficiencies, the morale issues. He spoke plainly, initially guarded, then with growing candor as he realized I was actually listening, not just waiting for my turn to speak. I proposed some immediate changes based on his insights, simple, practical solutions that Edward and Clara had overlooked in their pursuit of grand, abstract strategies. When the meeting ended, he looked at me with a flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect. You actually get it," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. That small moment meant more than any headline. My quiet competence was the most powerful weapon against their noise and bluster. The inversion of the power dynamic was now complete. They were the ones reacting, scrambling, trying to discredit me. I was the one setting the agenda, making decisions, shaping the future of the company they thought was theirs. And I was doing it with a quiet strength they had never anticipated, never seen coming. The memory of their dismissive words, useless, no longer stung as fiercely. It was fading, replaced by the quiet hum of purpose, the steady beat of my own capable heart. The aftermath of the acquisition wasn't a fairy tale ending, not in the traditional sense. There was no grand, triumphant parade. Taking control of the Pinnacle Group meant stepping into a complex, challenging reality. The company was indeed in trouble, deeper trouble than even I had initially realized. The debt was significant, internal morale was low, and the market was unforgiving. My days became filled with board meetings, financial reviews, strategic planning sessions. I worked long hours, immersed in the details of the business, the very kind of thing they said I wasn't built for. And I found, to my quiet satisfaction, that I was good at it. My ability to listen, to analyze, to see the connections others missed. Skills honed in years of quiet observation and meticulous research were invaluable. I wasn't a charismatic visionary like Edward purported to be, nor a ruthless deal-maker like Clara. My strength lay in my steady hand, my focus on fundamentals, my willingness to trust the expertise of the people on the ground, the employees who actually kept the company running. I made changes, difficult changes. There were redundancies, restructurings. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always popular. But I made decisions based on what was best for the long-term health of the company, not on ego or short-sighted ambition. I implemented policies aimed at improving morale, listened to employee concerns, created channels for feedback that hadn't existed under the previous leadership. It was slow, hard work, the kind that doesn't make headlines. Edward and Clara were, for the most part, gone from the company. Edward had resigned shortly after the acquisition, unwilling or unable to work under my leadership. Clara had been terminated. Their departure wasn't the triumphant moment of revenge I might have imagined in my darkest hours. It was quieter, almost anticlimactic. They were simply, they're not there anymore. Their absence left a void, a strange silence where their constant presence and pronouncements used to be. I saw them occasionally from a distance, heard whispers of their lives, attempts to start new ventures that reportedly met with limited success. The fall from their self-made pedestal had been steep. The symbolic object, my old portfolio from years ago, now sat on my desk at Pinnacle headquarters, not as a trophy but as a quiet reminder. A reminder of where I had come from, of the skills that had been dormant, waiting to be rediscovered. The house, my sanctuary, was no longer a cage. It was still my home, a place of peace, but my world had expanded far beyond its walls. The garden still thrived, tended with care, a grounding contrast to the corporate world. There was a bittersweet quality to it all. I had achieved something extraordinary, something they had deemed impossible for me. I had proven them wrong, not just to myself, but to the world. But the victory wasn't purely sweet. The cost had been the fracturing of family, the end of a significant chapter of my life. The scars of their dismissal, their judgment, remained. They were no longer open wounds, but they were part of me, a testament to the pain I had endured and the resilience I had found. I was no longer the useless woman in the quiet house. I was the CEO, the leader, the woman who had dared to reclaim her own narrative. The journey had been long, arduous, and marked by deep emotional pain. But standing here, in the company they once lorded over, navigating its challenges with quiet competence, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was anything but useless. The redemption wasn't in their fall, but in my own rise, in the rediscovery of my strength, my capability, my unwavering sense of self. And that, in the end, was a victory far more profound than any acquisition.